سجل اليوم.
All
أيوة.
right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we are being
جلال.
recorded. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So today we're going to continue with what we were talking about in regards to the tafsir for the ayat. Let's really quick just go over some of the things that we talked about last time, just really quick. So we were going really over this piece of it. Hold on, where was it? So not that one, right this, no, it wasn't that one. Okay, this area right there, okay? Let me just highlight it for you. So we were going over this area, and then the scholars went in details in regards to this area, and we said that they were discussing based on the premise whether it was revealed before Hijrah or whether it was revealed after Hijrah, and whether it is exclusive to these items, these three items, that is, meaning the haram things are only in these three items, or whether they would be inclusive to the other items mentioned later, or at least other items mentioned at other times. So we went in details with different types of animals. We talked about monkeys, we talked about snakes, we talked about jerboas, we talked about left and right, we talked about elephants, we talked about frogs, we talked about different animals. And the most important, let's say, debate was really that hadith, or that area, is every single carnivore animal, are they necessarily just for being carnivore animals? Does that make them haram to consume, haram to eat, or not? And then, well, what does that include in which carnivore animals? And then we said that they debated whether carnivore animals are even haram or not. And then we basically had quoted Ibn Abdul Bar, we quoted a number of different scholars, and we also quoted that hadith that disproves, at least, or at least considers, the preponderant opinion is that carnivore animals are haram for the hadith that was mentioned, and certainly not only one, but a couple. So we definitely considered that, yes, there is that opinion, but just because, keep that one in mind, just because there's an opinion out there, that does not mean that it's a considerable opinion. So just because you have that opinion, the scholar's note on a specific topic, that's not an evidence to necessarily use and say, hey, this scholar said this, therefore it's an evidence. The only one that you would use as an evidence is basically the Prophet ﷺ, well, the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, those are the only textual evidences that I can say, I've got the text to prove it. Other than that, we cannot use as, well, I've got an evidence because this or that scholar said something. The scholar's note on a matter does not in itself stand as an evidence or as a considerable reference unless it is supported by evidence, meaning textual evidence from Quran and Sunnah. Yet, we can use the scholar's note or a scholar's, let's call it, methodology to derive a certain ruling. We may look into that as something we would call it lil-isti'nas. What does that mean? Lil-isti'nas means to give you supporting evidence or supporting opinions or a backup, let's call it that way, in order to see what other scholars, based on their study, their scrutiny, and what they had come to find. Yet, it's important to keep in mind that whenever we would have a scholar's note, we would need other scholars to endorse that opinion. If we don't have other scholars to endorse that opinion, and or we would have majority of the scholars actually endorsing otherwise, in other words, completely objecting to that opinion becomes considered a shadh qawl, more of an aberration, and not necessarily something that we would use to say, well, here's what Islam says on this, and then quote perhaps al-Badri, or quote maybe, I don't know, some scholar, and they could be important scholars. And just because we may have rejected or found evidence to support at least a problem, or how this opinion was not accepted, not until we find a series of aberrations that this scholar was accused of, or this scholar had fallen in, would we consider that this scholar is going to lack the credibility. Just keep that one in mind. So just because a scholar had a problem, or a scholar said an opinion that other scholars completely did not endorse, that doesn't mean that that scholar is to completely be canceled out. Just keep that one in mind. Every single scholar, every single alim basically has their areas of flaws, their areas of weakness, their areas where they might not have been perhaps fully aware, or fully or thoroughly studied this or that matter. So just keep this one in mind, to just have that adab al-ilm, and recognize how we find the methodologies, how we find those resources, how we use these or those opinions, and how we put it in the context of letting it go, or making use of it, or considering it as a backup, or using it as basically the evidence. Now, the question is regards to the Sahabi's opinion. Do we necessarily regard just the companion's opinion as an evidence to support, or to say, well, I've got Umar ibn al-Khattab say that, and therefore is that enough evidence for me to say, okay, there you go, this actually proves this is what Islam supports, or this is what Islam does not support. We're going to talk about that inshallah in just a bit. We're also going to talk about different reasons for different types of illah. What is al-illah? We talked about the difference between illah and hikmah. And we said hikmah is not necessarily coming in with a specific type of a reasoning, but it is more fluid. You can have multiple fluid, let's say, reasons, or fluid different ways of seeing the wisdom behind a certain halal, haram, or a certain ruling, but you cannot use the wisdom as a way to use it as a crux, or a paradigm, or a standard in order to rule on other matters, and say, okay, since the wisdom on, let's say, eating pork is that it has these parasites, then I'm going to say, okay, now we're going to see every single animal that might have a similar parasite that's going to be haram. Not too fast. That's one wisdom, but that's not exclusive to it. Well, certainly we don't want people getting sick, but that will not necessarily take the same ruling as the ruling that we would deal with pork or pigs. So when we look at pork, or we look at pigs, yes, it's haram to consume it. Scholars had differences of opinions on things like gelatin, which basically involves boiling bones, or things like hair, or things like skin. All these different matters, and especially if it's tanned, of course, then scholars actually had differences of opinions in that regard. What about if we were to have a goat, for example, and the vet said that it was having this parasite? Does that mean using its hair, using its skin, using its leather, using all those different things, or even bones, does that make it haram because we found these parasites that are similar to the parasites that we found in pork or pigs? The answer is no, because that's a wisdom and not a illah. The true illah is in najasa, is impurity. Now, based on that najasa, that's where it basically went into analyzing different animals And part of that is what is called al-Jalala. Let me just give you an idea about al-Jalala. Al-Jalala can be a halal animal to eat. This animal is halal to eat, but it was not fed the proper foods that is considered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala / nature, that it is actually within its diet. So making that animal basically considered as perhaps impure, or perhaps not healthy, or perhaps maybe not acceptable, just for, we're going to say. So what is jalala? The word jalala basically means wandering. So we're talking about these animals that may be wandering, and they don't have, I guess, they're not like domestic animals that are being taken care of. At least their foods are being watched by their own caretakers, or they're probably not feeding them. If, of course, we're talking about, even if they were inside cages, they were inside barns, they're probably caretakers are feeding them, maybe just like the issue about mad cows, when they were feeding them those cows and putting them inside their, I guess, their barley, and putting them inside their own food. And then the cow basically is starved, and then the only thing that it would have to eat is basically this barley and this whatever grass that is mixed with other animals' flesh that had died. But of course, these farmers, they just wanted to pay less in terms of what they're feeding the animals. So they thought, well, just chop this up, just put it inside their food. As long as they're eating it and everything's fine, then they're not dying, then therefore we're fine. And then later, they basically developed what is called the mad cows and all of that. At the end of the day, al-Jalala, whether you see it basically in their meat, or whether you just see that they're fed wrong, scholars actually had differences of opinions on those al-Jalala. Let's see. Abu Dawood narrated upon Ibn Umar. Who's Ibn Umar? The son of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah. What did he say? Quote, the Prophet ﷺ had forbid eating from al-Jalala and even its milk. In another narration, he said in regards to al-Jalalati fil ibil, in regards to al-Jalala, meaning the ibil, the camels that are wandering off, that, the question in regards to riding on it, drinking from its milk, and basically that the Prophet ﷺ, according to this hadith, or at least the other narration, is that it would include these animals. In other words, not until we know that they are being fed right, they are being taken care of right, are we going to consume that. But is that the case? Let's see, al-Halimi. Now, just an idea about al-Halimi. Just an idea about al-Halimi. He's actually a Shafi'i scholar and not a Maliki scholar. I actually prepared something about al-Halimi. Let me see right there, al-Halimi, and I'm going to let you see it. So this is just al-Halimi. Before we quote him, I think it's important for us to actually read about him. Remember, this is called Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. We talked about it before, and we said it's in almost 20 volumes, or 20-some volumes, all right? And it was written by al-Dhahabi. And al-Dhahabi, he basically dedicated himself to, well, mainly researching hadith, and he was one of the students of Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, just a note. Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, he basically combined in these 25, well, even probably more volumes, combined it. He called it Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, which basically means the stories of the nobles, the history, the biography of noble ones. Okay, so of course, Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, a great book to go to, but I thought it would be a good idea to also let's see, give you a translation right there. So I won't be necessarily just reading without you seeing all of this. Let's see. He said, Al-Qadi al-Allama. Said Al-Qadi, he's basically Al-Qadi, meaning he just translated it as Al-Qadi, or actually wrote it like that, but it actually means he was a judge. And he was the master of the chief of al-muhaddithin, the chief of the scholars of hadith in al-mutakallimin. Now, one thing I would like to say, al-mutakallimin, at one point, here he translated it as speakers, but that's not actually true. I mean, that's not an accurate translation. So just wanted you to see some of those AI translations and how inaccurate they can get. Okay, المتكلمين actually means a scholar on aqidah. Doesn't mean speakers and they're, I don't know, in some speaker's corner or whatever it is. This is talking about not public speaking per se, but this is actually talking about aqidah, and specifically more for the madhab ash'ari. Okay, and when you look at bima wara in-nahr, when, let's say he said beyond the river, what do you mean? He's a speaker beyond the river? So what does that even look like? Well, when you look at wara in-nahr, I'm going to take you right there. Okay, when we say wara in-nahr, what are we really talking about? We're talking about those countries, okay, here we go. Okay, that's it. I can't get to say it. Okay, now these countries would be Bilad ma wara al-Nahr, the countries that are beyond the two rivers, actually, Jihun River, right there, Tirmidh, Khurasan. Now, Khurasan was actually considered as, at one point, kind of like one country, and there basically is right there. So you look at that, that's all Khurasan. You're seeing a part of Afghanistan, a part of Iran, a part of Turkmenistan, a part of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, basically. Those countries were actually under, let's say, similar circumstances. And at one point, they were actually under one major rules in couple times, Sassan, and just different empires and so forth. So I'll just let you see it, and you could see part of Pakistan as well right there. So just to get an idea. And in fact, there is a hadith. I don't really know about its level and its authenticity, that that Dajjal would come out from Khurasan. There is a hadith. I don't know how authentic it is, so don't take it, as an authentic.
Yeah, I hear about it.
Right. It's a very famous thing, but I don't really know how authentic it is. So this is just an idea. When we look at Khurasan, we talked about the scholar, just to get an idea. You got many scholars actually came from this area. In fact, there is a hadith for the Prophet ﷺ that he said that if knowledge was hung on like a chandelier in the skies, you would have a group of men from Bilad Faris, from the Persian countries. In other words, they would do whatever it takes to basically go up and grab this light and grab the light from these chandeliers that might be hung up in the sky. Okay, and that's why you have a lot of scholars. So you got Abu Hanifa was from Afghanistan, and he was actually from Kabul originally. Yes, he was born and raised in Iraq, but originally he was actually from Kabul. You have Bukhari, you have Tirmidhi, you have many other scholars, especially scholars in Hadith. They were actually from this area. Okay, from the area of what is called Bilad ma wara al-Nahr. So they used to see it as, here's this river right there, and here's that river right there. Right now, one of these rivers, I can't remember which one, is actually dried, which is actually causing some trouble for that area, but it was dried. And it is this area where even Ya'juj and Ma'juj were in. I know that sounds scary. They're still there. Where? I don't know. Okay.
Yes, Tirmizi, he narrated this hadith Sahih about يخرج الدجال من أرض من المشرق يقال لها خراسان يتبع أقوام كأن وجوههم المجان المطرقة.
المجان المطرقة.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
رواه الترمذي.
Right.
Sheikha, what about the hadith about the narration that they say that black flags will be arisen from this particular
Well, right. You know, I'm not necessarily saying, you know, you could see that this area is basically whether we're speaking about ilm basically being, let's call it a center for ilm, a center for very smart people, in a center for very, let's call it hyperactive as well. So you're talking about Ya'juj wa Ma'juj, you're talking about the Dajjal, you're talking about, so you're seeing a very hot climate area, and I don't mean that literally, I mean that metaphorically, but hot climate for a lot of the different things that, I mean, not to mention that at one point, just keep that one in mind, at one point, this area was actually considered the area that supported الخلافة الخلافة العباسية. If it wasn't for them, a lot of lives would have been lost. So you're talking about an area that was always a center for the ummah in ilm, a center for the ummah in power, a center for the ummah in resources as well. So think of it that way. So just to mention these points. But anyhow, let's go back to Al-Halimi right there. We were just talking about him. So that was Bilad Wara al-Nahr. And he was, of course, Bukhari from Bukhara. And when we're talking about Bukhara, we're talking about Uzbekistan. It's quite sad that right now, of course, we know with the alliances with Russia right now, things are basically changing, and I know a couple of people in Uzbekistan, they can probably tell us more about what's happening, but we're seeing Muslims basically, going along with this, what is called the Abrahamic Code or whatever it is, that they're trying to slip and empty Islam from its Islam. Okay, he was Shafi'i madhab, which is pretty strange for that area because that area is predominantly Hanafi and not Shafi'i. But I want you to look at this one. He said he was one of the intelligent people described. And from the, how did he translate that one? Described as one of the people of the madhab. Okay, well, that's not actually an accurate translation. He was actually one of the main figures within that school. What school? Within the Shafi'i school. I want you to see how inaccuracy in translation can actually get us way off. So let's see right there. And he was skilled. Well, actually, when we say mutafanninan, it's not that he was skilled, because when you say skill, you're talking about a carpenter, you're talking about a blacksmith, you're talking about, I don't know, just different types of skills. That's not what it means. When we say in the books of Islamic literature, we call somebody mutafannin, we're actually talking about hadith, we're talking about sciences of tafseer, we're talking about sciences of qira'at, we're talking about sciences of fiqh. That's what it means. In other words, in different arts or different schools or different departments. In the Islamic studies, he was basically one of the key teachers within that school or within that department. That's what it means. Certainly in the English language in the translation, although he said it was like 85%. Accuracy, but let's see how that goes. Okay, he said, Sayyala dhihn. Sayyala dhihn, well, this is more of an idiom when we say fluid in mind. This isn't talking about, some brain basically having extra cerebral fluid. No, this is actually talking about metaphorically, very smart, very fast in their thinking, and of course, in their eloquence, they're capable of explaining or at least communicating their thoughts in a fast way. So when we say sayyal al-dhihn, this is extremely important to remember. just by being smart, it's not enough for you to be smart unless you're capable of communicating your intelligence. So it's all about how capable are you in communicating the ideas that you manage to discover, that you manage to scrutinize in research. That's why they would speak of sayali dhihn can sometimes mean that they're intelligent in their scrutiny and their research, and they were capable of being fluid and being articulate about those thoughts, and basically, in other words, communication. Munadiran, that's why they said a debater. When we say debater, we're not talking about a person that is just an argumentative person. No, they used to describe a debater to mean that he was one of those scholars that managed to scrutinize and managed to basically undermine the different opinions or the different evidences that the opponents might have laid out, and then he would come in with evidences to disprove the other opponent's evidences or disprove their opinion. In other words, you won't be capable of doing that unless you did thorough research in studying their evidences and studying your evidences in order to get to an objective opinion, or at least a preponderant ruling. Let's say, and he said he had taken his ilm basically on al-Qaffal, who's actually an Shafi'i as well, al-Khayyam, etc. But look at this one. Look at this translation, okay? He said, ولد في سنة 38 و300 فقيل إنه ولد بجرجان وحمل فنشأ ببخارى وقيل بل ولد ببخارى. Look at the weird translation. He was born in year 38 and 300, okay? And it was said he was born in Jarjan, okay? And he became pregnant. He became pregnant. Okay. And how did that happen? Okay. It's wahumila, not wahamala. But see how the wrong translation can really go off. He became pregnant. Seriously? Way off. Okay. The word is wahumila, meaning he was born in Jarjan, which is a city, I believe, in around Uzbekistan area. And then later, he was basically humila, meaning that he was taken by his family in a different area, and he was basically raised in Bukhara in Uzbekistan, or it was said that he was even born in Bukhara in Uzbekistan. Okay, but I wanted you to see this wahumila, and instead it read it as wahamala, and then that Humila and Hamala basically created a completely funny and a very hilarious translation. See, that's why we really need Lugha Arabiya to make sure that we really go back to the resources and not just the translation. So, I mean, nice try, AI translation, but definitely some work is needed. Or he grew up in Bukhara. It was said he was born in Bukhara. He has some valuable works. When you say valuable works, actually musannafat means valuable. He was a valuable author. He had written valuable, what we call it today, we call it a masterpiece. Call it a masterpiece, and that's what it means. Okay, but didn't say that, he just said valuable works. What type of work are we talking about? Okay, so there we go. Now at least just wanted you to see this one, but I also wanted you to see that in that year that he had died in, you had a couple scholars actually die on that year, or that same year. Let's say you had al-Baqillani, and you had the scholar al-Gabisi, well, al-Gabisi actually means he was from Tunisia, a Tunisian scholar from a city called Gabis. And let's say, and al-Badri, basically the one to explain Sunan Abi Dawud as well. And the main scholar in one of the main scholars of Al-Hanabila, Al-Warraq, and another scholar, let's see, As-Sarsari. So I just wanted to note that one. There was a year in one of those years that we, was it 1999? I believe it was 1999. We had a couple great scholars die on that year. We had Al-Albani, we had Ibn Baz, and we also had Mustafa Zarqa. And Al-Albani was in Syria. Mustafa Zarqa was in Syria. Mustafa Zarqa is actually one of my favorite scholars, by the way. Very, very outstanding, very intelligent scholar. And certainly, we definitely need to know more about those scholars and all those contributions. So just an idea right there. So the question is, if we're talking about these scholars, how did Islam even get to those areas? And the secret is basically this name, Qutayba ibn Muslim al-Bahili. Qutayba ibn Muslim al-Bahili, he was the key figure to bring Islam to the area that we were just talking about and calling it Bilad Mawara al-Nahr, and talking about Transonia right there, and basically bring Islam to those areas and bring Islam to Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, etc. And it was always a place of one, ilm, a place of war, a place that acted, think of Palestine. Think of Palestine because you're talking about an area that is one, even densely populated, China right there. And of course, it is right there going into a new world. So you're talking about a series. Look at these mountains right there. These mountains right there, they would act as a terrain that may sometimes be a geographical border. So this geographical border, then later consider it as a border that confines or puts a certain group of people together. And because you're talking about, let's look at it right there. Look at these mountainous areas and these mountainous areas. So you're looking at this area being, let's say, an area that would be safe and easy to be livable. So that's why you had those areas, unlike Afghanistan, very mountainous, very dangerous, etc. And you would have those areas, basically the Mughal and the Mongols, etc. Later on, they were the ones to later take over and commit all those massacres in all those areas of Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, etc. And not to mention, it wasn't until these tribes were the ones to actually give that backup for the Khalifa. The Khalifa was weakened and the Mongols were coming in, and it wasn't until, of course, those people were the ones to give that protection to the Khilafah. Okay, let's say Al-Jalala right there, since we are talking about Al-Halimi. What did he say? He said, as for Al-Jalala, the reason why it is haram is because it eats the animal's feces. And that would mean that this would include, or at least the ruling would include, if chickens were mukhallat. Okay, mukhallat means what? That these chickens were probably just left out and about and not necessarily put in a chicken's, what do they call that? A barn or whatever it's called. And then in an area where we know that they are given barley or they're given basically these seeds and they're just eating these items that we are feeding them. But if we are letting these chickens wander around on their own, they could be eating, what he's concerned about is really eating things like other animal feces. Okay. So therefore, he said, well, the Prophet ﷺ had forbidden eating from these animals and eating basically their flesh. So cooking basically perhaps chicken, and not because it's chicken, it doesn't make it halal unless it's actually fed the right foods. The foods that were by nature or by its own nature is basically healthy for it to consume. Okay, how are we going to know what it basically consumed? So then other scholars, they said, well, we could see if we are basically finding some smell in its own flesh and its own meat, and you could even taste that its own flesh is tasting rather weird and tasting rather that it's not totally clean, then in that situation, this is most likely jalala. This most likely is jalala. So therefore, Islam is recommending that you would watch out for what you eat, not only for halal haram reasons, but even for healthy reasons. Islam wants you to be healthy in what you consume, not just because it's out there. Halal is not your only parameter, but even if we're talking about healthy, is another important parameter. Let's see al-Khattabi and what he said. Al-Khattabi, I'm going to just cancel this one right there. So we basically, I'll go over. Okay, no, hold on. So we talked about this. We're going to close all those different things that, hold on, let's go right there. I'm going to talk about him. No, here we go. Al-Khattabi. Now, for al-Khattabi, let's just learn about al-Khattabi for a little bit. Well, he said that this is not necessarily a parameter of haram, and we have to differentiate between halal haram and between something that is healthy. Yes, Islam will tell you to be healthy, but that does not make it within the parameter of haram, but it just tells you that it's not recommended for you. So he said, this is nahyu tanazzuhin wa tanazzuf. He said, this is basically forbidding you from the standpoint of staying clean and staying pure. And in other words, it's tanazzuh. In other words, Islam doesn't recommend it for you, and therefore it tells you that it is jalala and not necessarily haram. Okay, what's the difference? This is basically saying, well, what we're trying to tell you is that il-jalala, according to al-Khattabi, is not making it necessarily haram, but it's just letting you know that Islam doesn't recommend it for you because it lacks hygiene. Why? He said, well, because if it feeds on different things that are probably as maybe animal droppings, and we could smell the smell from its own flesh, and we may see that it was probably feeding on some of these items, then what is going to happen is that it would take all of these as what will build its own flesh, and therefore what we have to be inconsiderate of is, yes, this flesh is right now not as healthy, and therefore it's contaminated. But if it was feeding the right foods and it was feeding the right seeds, if by any chance it probably came across something and it started perhaps picking on it and eating it, that does not necessarily make it jalala unless it affected thoroughly its diet and affected its taste or its smell. But just because one time your cat probably maybe, defecated in an area, and then your chicken came over and started basically picking on that, that does not make a jalala on the spot. Okay, just keep that one in mind. We're talking about a system here. We're talking about a long period of time that it was just feeding on different unhealthy, unclean, or unclean compost and all those different things, then therefore that would be jalala. So similar to the different chickens that are probably left out and about. Okay, now here's one thing. When you look at, you look at al-Khattabi, I think it's a good idea to just look at al-Khattabi and just learn about al-Khattabi before we just quote, just a quote like that. So here we go. We're going to see who is al-Khattabi and why is he even important. Okay, let's see, I've got right there this article that same thing, same beautiful good book, Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, right there. You don't even have to buy the 25 volumes. They will cost you almost $500, but here you basically have it right there easily for you and for free. So yeah, can't get any better resources than basically having these books under your fingertips. Okay, what about al-Khattabi? So here we go. He basically was one of the key scholars. Let's look at that. One of these key scholars, maybe we could show you as well. I'm going to put that for you, just like we did for al-Halimi right there. I'm going to basically put that right there. Hope it allows me. Come on, you're going to do it. Okay, it's not allowing me. Hold on. Yes, it will allow me, inshallah. Let's see, we're going to do that right there. And here we go. There we go. Here we go. And you can get the translation. Just get it to translate. Now you see what I'm doing. Okay, let's see. Al-Imam al-Allama. Al-Imam, meaning the leading scholar. And he was al-Hafiz. Here, notice how they translate it as al-Hafiz. But al-Hafiz actually means the scholar that had memorized 500,000 hadiths. Yeah. About. Okay, so just keep that one in mind. I get a lot of times people asking me, when can I start teaching Islam? When can I be considered a scholar? We're all tulab ilm. But if this person didn't memorize Quran, didn't memorize the hadith, at least the 42 Nawawi hadith. Okay, they're just 42 hadith. Okay, but at least have a base right there. Then, we've got some homework to do. Al-Lughawi. Well, here, Al-Lughawi, they said al-linguistic. Well, it's not actually a-linguistic. It basically means that he was a scholar in Lugha Arabiya, in its grammar, in its I guess the phonics, and certainly we're talking about the structure, we're talking about the etymology, we're talking about the conjugation, which is sarf, etc. That's what it means. So you cannot really be a scholar unless you learn Lugha Arabiya, whether we're speaking about the structure in Lugha Arabiya, meaning grammar, or whether we're speaking about semantics, or whether we're speaking about the different things that relate to understanding Lugha Arabiya in the right way. Because if this person didn't study the key resources, which is basically called the knowledge or the sciences in al-adat, they're just the key sciences. Think of them as the tools. Those are the tools that you need in order to unlock the books of Tafseer, unlock the books of fiqh, unlock the books of perhaps Lugha Arabiya, etc. Those are basically considered the key sciences. So if we don't have these key sciences, then for sure we're not going to be capable of unlocking all those books on tafsir and fiqh and hadith and so forth. And they're basically called ulum al-ala. Ulum al-ala. When you say al-ala, it doesn't necessarily mean a tool like, your monkey wrench and these kind of tools. No, this is telling you that these are the keys. Ulum al-ala, they're keys to unlocking other sciences. Without the science of one, knowing a hadith and memorization for the Quran and the hadith, or even the key to unlock, which is in lugha, in language, in Lugha Arabiya, then you're not going to be capable of having the foundation. If you don't have the foundation, then you're not going to go beyond in being a scholar or being within that area that is capable of understanding the data, scrutinizing it, differentiating different data, and being able to differentiate between a hadith sahih and a hadith that is not sahih. Well, that's basically part of understanding the data. And then you have the second piece of it, which is the interpretation for the data. So figuring out the data, understanding and classifying the data, authentic, not authentic, understanding and having the tools to understand the data is one thing, and then being capable of interpreting this data is another level. Okay, so that's why, just an idea about al-Khattabi himself basically had written a couple important books, and the most important book is basically the book for Abu Dawood. Now, Abu Dawood, when you say Rawahu, Abu Dawood, etc., that's the book that he mainly worked on. I mean, it's not that he doesn't have other books. You could see he has books on the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically has books on Tazkiyah as well. He has books on Sharh al-Sunan right there. That's the key one. Sharh al-Sunan meaning Sunan Abi Dawood. Okay. And if you talk about Abu Dawood, you definitely need to be talking about al-Khattabi. So going back to him, now we see this great scholar and why somebody like al-Qurtubi would definitely honor al-Khattabi and the works that he had contributed. All right, let's see. He said, and this is to basically make sure that it's clean. Okay, now here's the other thing. أصحاب الرأي والشافعي وأحمد. Who are أصحاب الرأي? أصحاب الرأي, it's not that they were saying things just out of their own opinion or just basically their own take on a matter. No, أصحاب الرأي, those are basically, that's basically the description that was given to the Hanafi scholars. So why such a condescending, is it a condescending statement? No. Let's explain why. The reason why they were called Ashab al-Ra'i was because the situation in Baghdad / al-Iraq at the time, you had, al-Iraq had a very, very rich history that dates all the way back to the Babylon empires and kingdoms and all of that. And well, that area, it has its own terrain, it has its own composition of different races as well. So you have the Turkmenis, you have the Kurds, you have the Sharkas as well. You also have the Arab. You also have the Persians. So think of that. Remember when we were looking at Khurasan and all of that, and we talked about that. So then the terrain of all this melting pot that you saw in Transonia, that basically starts stretching out to that area. So Iraq had multiple religions, multiple races, multiple languages, multiple societies. And even when they had become Muslim, or at least Islam came in Iraq, it still was not completely free of all those different, let's call them battles of ideas, battles of philosophies, and the list goes on and on. Well, Abu Hanifa was living in the midst of all this turmoil of ideas, religions, intentions, and the list goes on and on. And plus, he was a little distant from al-Medina. So the resources were not accessible as much as they were accessible to Imam Malik in Medina, Imam Darul Hijrah. Abu Hanifa was living in a completely different circumstance. And therefore, you had many people who were making up a hadith. And because of that, he felt that it was necessary to scrutinize the different resources before we jump into just taking any hadith, but we have to make sure that it's actually valid. Well, that is why, as part of their methodology in research, they would consider logic, or they would consider basically certain paradigms, and that's what they managed to do better than any other madhab, which is scrutinizing the different resources that they had in order to canonize and know how to study the methodology of research, the methodology and the paradigms that the fiqh depends on. Okay, Shafi'i and Ahmad, and they basically said, well, you're not supposed to be eating this jalala unless we would basically cage it for a couple days and we would feed it the diet that it's supposed to be feeding in. And then if its own flesh had become better, you could see a change in its diet, a change in its flesh, a change in its basically behavior, then you're going to consider that that was the treatment for it. So that's basically based on the Hanafis and based on the Shafi'is and based on the Ahmad. They said, just cage it for a few days, and that should be enough. Once you are feeding it right, that should be enough to clean out all the contamination that affected through its own food and through the diet that it was eating. Now we're giving it a clean diet. It should be safe, according to those scholars. But here's one thing. When you say, he said, وَقَدْ رُوِيَ في حديث أن البقرة تعلف 40 يوما ثم يؤكل لحمها. Okay, he said there was a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had basically said that cows are supposed to be, in other words, clean fed for 40 days, and then you would eat its flesh. Well, thank God that they made it easy for us, at least the ones that reviewed this tafsir. And they said, well, I'll make it easy for you. That narration was narrated by al-Bayhaqi, and he also said, لَيْسَ هَذَا بِالْقَوِي, that the hadith is not really too strong for us to depend on. Ibn Umar used to confine at least the chickens for 3 days, and then he would slaughter them. Well, here's one thing. Is that necessarily something that we need to do to even perhaps, even when we're talking about its own eggs? But wait a minute, chickens also eat earthworms. In fact, that's their favorite food. They go and dig for the earthworms and they start, I lived on a ranch, so they absolutely love earthworms. And believe it or not, I know this is going to sound disgusting for some of you, but for somebody that lived on a ranch, I know this is actually true and really, something that is a fact. The eggs that the chickens basically make, the chickens that are fed on basically earthworms, and they're within a clean area, at least to a certain level, and not necessarily fed, barley and grass and these things right there, but they're actually fed things like we're talking about cabbage or even carrots or just different foods, that they actually make the best eggs. They make the best eggs, and the eggs, they don't smell eggy. They actually taste really good. I can only eat those type of eggs. All other eggs cannot eat it, cannot handle it until the time of today. Look how many years had passed since I lived on a ranch. What we're looking at 40 some years. Okay. And until now, I cannot eat one egg. Okay, I'll force it down my throat, but I cannot eat it and I cannot stand the smell. Only those types of eggs that were fed in nature, those are the only good eggs that you could really taste the difference. Okay, now here, so if Ibn Umar had done that, should we necessarily take, just because Ibn Umar had done that, does that mean that we could only use that? Let's say, we're going to get to. We're going to get to that. Ishaq said, well, who's Ishaq? Ishaq ibn Rahoya or Rahaway? Both. Now, Ishaq ibn Rahawayh or Rahoya was originally from a city called Maru. Where is that at? That's basically Merv in Uzbekistan. Okay, that city was actually considered the main city for many scholars. You can consider that city that it was actually a university. The children, the mothers, the fathers, everybody there was basically serving this university that was there. It was just a scholarly site where everybody was either a scholar or a student or working as part of a research basically institution. That was Maru in Uzbekistan. Well, it wasn't just Uzbekistan, but different cities within Uzbekistan, it was considered as a university place. Think of today, Harvard, that's Maru, and that's Merv right there. Just see that. Ishaq ibn Rahoya, and the name Rahoya was actually not his name, but it actually meant, when I even researched it, it actually meant priest or a guru or a chief or something like that in that language. So I don't know exactly if I'm saying the word right, but anyhow, his father's name was not Rahoya, but it seems like it was out of I guess, respect. Okay, he said it is permissible to eat it, that is the jalala, if you were to wash it thoroughly. If you were to wash it thoroughly, but does that actually change the composition deep on the inside? Well, we already know it doesn't. But I'm just letting you know that opinion. كان الحسن لا يرى بأسا بأكل لحوم الجلالة. In al-Hasan, and this isn't al-Hasan ibn Ali. This is actually al-Hasan to one of the Maliki scholars, and he used to not find anything wrong with eating these animals, basically that are jalala. And that's basically the same opinion as Malik ibn Anas. Let's see. So from that standpoint, let's look at this one. From that standpoint, they basically had said, well, because of the animals might be feeding on different things, we should not be just laying or perhaps letting, let's say, I don't know, you've got a cat or whatever it is, letting it just basically defecate in different areas. I mean, cats are actually different because they dig a hole in the ground and then they close it up. They close it up after that. And certainly it's kind of different, but if you're talking about other animals, so you've got horses, you've got cows, or you've got camels or whatever it is, and you're taking it through the city, please pick up whatever it basically had defecated off the street to make sure that others are not stepping on it and also not affecting the area's hygiene. Okay, let's see. There, from that standpoint, there were some scholars that they used to, at the time, they would rent their land. They may sell the land and they may even rent it. How can you rent a land? Like, what would you rent it? Now, during our times, we would think of a land only useful if you want to build a house on it. But no, at that time, you can rent a land a year, 2 years, or whatever it is, to basically use for farming. They would rent a land and basically use it as for farming. And some landowners, now that's a real landowner and not, that's a real landowner, they used to consider that part of the conditions is that they would not have any animal droppings or human basically defecation be put in this, on this, basically this land or in this land. Now, at the time, remember, they didn't used to have public bathrooms, so they would defecate or animals would defecate and it would basically be buried in earth to let it decompose and basically become a part of the earth again. But of course, you could see that some scholars, they used to consider that the area and the land. Look at this one. Now we're talking about a different type of a restriction. Some scholars actually considered that even when it comes to land, they did not like, they didn't say it was haram, but they didn't like that things as basically droppings, defecation, whatever it is, that it would be basically put in that land. So some of them had said they would rent the land in Medina, and that they would consider that it is holy, and they would put a condition that they would not put any feces basically in that earth. And same thing Ibn Umar. Well, why Ibn Umar? So is this also what we're supposed to be doing? No, I guess just out of sanctity of Medina, that they wanted to keep the earth clean. That, yeah, I don't want you putting any defecation in that earth. Even if you were to close it, I want the place to stay basically pure. That was according to some opinion, but is that necessarily everybody? The answer is no. Let's see, it was narrated that a man used to, in fact, fertilize his land with, all that feces. Umar ibn al-Khattab then sees him, he says, are you the one that's feeding people what would basically get out of them? I want you just to see that one. Let's see. Said أخرجه ابن أبي شيبة. Remember we said Ibn Abi Shayba, Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba. It's almost in, again, like almost 25 volumes. And Musannaf Ibn Abd al-Razzaq is also in almost 25 volumes. Okay, it's almost 25 volumes. Okay, and let's say, so in why the Musannafat? The Musannaf usually contains athar. Okay, what is al-athar? Al-athar basically means the narration, the quote that is quoted off a sahabi. Okay, so this is what they did. Do I have to do the same thing? That's the question. Do I have to take these sahaba and their practice as necessarily the evidence and what I personally do in my life as well? Or is this not necessarily like that? So that's what I want to take you to basically look at. And what we're going to do right there, we're just going to get you just a small note right there. I'm going to put you the English and the Arabic part of it for you to see. Okay, and I thought it would be a good idea to just lay out for you the differences of opinion so you could see it. All right, so we're going to give you that one, and then for this one, we're going to give you this one, and they're going to let you see both of them. Okay, let's see, here's that translation as well. Wanted to give you that one. Okay, now the question is a prophet's companion necessarily capable of being on its own as a reference, as an evidence for us to depend on? Scholars actually have three differences of opinions. Just a note. The study that examines these references, these methodologies, is called usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh. Very simple. The foundations of fiqh. They would be the ones to scrutinize and basically say whether this acts as a resource or a valid resource or not. Let's say the first opinion basically said that the companion, his opinion or his words and quotations are basically considered as absolute proof, and that you would have to go back to them in order, hey, that's the opinion, that's the evidence. You've got only basically the Sahabi's words for Imam Ahmad and many of Ahl al-Hadith. Now, Ahl what did you say? Ahl al-Hadith. Okay, so why did you call them Ahl al-Hadith? And before, you said there was something called Ahl al-Ra'i. That's true. Ahl al-Ra'i would be the Hanafi school. Ahl al-Hadith would mainly be the Hanbali, would mainly be the Maliki as well, Shafi'i, depending on who, etc. But in general, they said, well, we've got an evidence for you. What is the evidence? The Prophet ﷺ had said in a hadith, Ashabi amanatun li ummati. maybe that's a weak hadith. Can't be. Why not? Well, because it was narrated by Sahih Muslim. So what does it mean anyways? It says, my companions are a protection for the ummah. Meaning as long as they're there, and therefore they will be guided, they will be basically the ones to be the resource that you would take. So if Ibn Abbas, for example, he basically made an explanation for an ayah, no other Sahabi disagreed with him on that explanation, then that's enough for us to know that their silence in a circumstance where they are capable of saying, well, actually, you got that wrong, or they're disagreeing with him, that their silence is a way to let us know that they had seen it as a de facto. The second opinion said, well, it's only approved only if no other companion disagreed. In other words, then we would know that there's some, at least like a pseudo unanimous agreement. And that was basically mentioned by Shafi'i and the majority of the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh. So how do we understand it? They said, well, if you don't know any other companion and that they didn't necessarily disagree with him, and you don't know any other disagreement, that's when I'm going to take that as an evidence and not necessarily just his own words. I know it kind of sounds like the one before it. Okay, it kind of sounds like the one before it, because we're talking about, okay, I'll use it, but are we going to condition that no one is objecting, or how do we understand that? So just like if, let's say, Abdullah ibn Umar says something, we don't have any other Sahabi that objected this or disagreed with this, and then that situation, according to Shafi'i and many scholars in Usul, they said as long as we don't have any objection, we don't have a known objection to this interpretation, then we have no choice but to take that as evidence, because they definitely, being close to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and being taught by the Prophet ﷺ, they have a better understanding than you and I. Let's see the third opinion. Basically said, well, it's never going to be considered as proof. Why not? Well, they said, because if you were to use it as proof, you've got a problem. Why? They said, well, remember the ayah that we were just doing. The ayah that we were just doing, they basically right there. Let's go back to that ayah. What was it saying? Right there. قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ فِيمَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا. Said, well, I mean, that's to let you know that al-wahi is actually your resource. So not a personal opinion that someone, even if it's a Sahabi, might do. Because what really matters is the opinion coming and tracing all the way from al-wahi. Certainly the other scholars, they said, well, yes, we agree with you that al-wahi is basically a resource. But guess what? If all these companions did not disagree, then that's to let us know that they recognize that that is what they were taught. In other words, it traces all the way back to al-wahi. It isn't his own personal opinion. Okay. And of course, they said, we've got another evidence. They said a Sahabi might make mistakes, they might forget, and it's not necessarily coming from wahi. Therefore, you cannot tell me that I would have to abide by the Sahabi's opinion. Okay. Now, just to let you know, all of that, if in case when they would have a unanimous agreement, then in that situation, they would basically have to consider that was ijma'. Okay, so just wanted to note on that one before we would go back to the tafsir. How do we understand all those different opinions in regards to what they had said about al-jalala? So just to keep that one in mind. When we're talking about al-jalala, we're definitely talking about differences of opinions. Is it to just be washed, like Ishaq ibn Rawais had said, or is it to be caged until it basically becomes pure again? Or are we supposed to just entirely avoid it? Or is this avoidance not relating to religious preference, but it is more of your own taste preference? But if you didn't mind so, just like al-Khattabi had considered, then it's recommended for you not to consume it, but it's not necessarily haram. Okay, let's go for the other opinion. Said, and they had differences of opinions on eating horses. الشافعي regarded it as halal, and al-Qurtubi, I want you to learn that one. Al-Qurtubi said, وهو صحيح. Wait a minute. Al-Qurtubi, I thought you said al-Qurtubi was Maliki. There you go. Al-Qurtubi was Maliki, but he was not blinded by basically considering his madhab, but considered that the madhab that we go to is basically the Prophet ﷺ, regardless of what a scholar might say. And that's why it's important to recognize that even if you are to follow a certain madhab, just because a certain madhab says one opinion, that doesn't necessarily make it the evidence that I would base my Islam on. The evidence that I would base Islam on is not based on what a Shafi'i said, what Malik said, but what the evidence proved. So al-Qurtubi did not necessarily want to support Imam Malik because he's on his madhab. And that's why he said, وهو صحيح. He said, no, I agree with the Shafi'i madhab right there, that it is permissible to eat, according to al-Qurtubi. كرهها Malik. Malik, basically the Maliki scholar, he hated that. Why? Well, there are differences of opinions why some scholars hated eating horses. Not because they're herbivores, because herbivores are supposed to be halal. So why did they consider that they hated eating horses? So then they had differences of opinions. Is it because they were the ones to, of course, we've got numerous ahadith that praise horses. Is it that to give it this honor that, hey, just like al-ayah, in Surah al-Qari'ah, not al-Qari'ah, sorry, وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا, Surah al-Adiyat. What is وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا? You know, it's quite interesting. One day I was hearing this active revert, and he said, وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا, there's no meaning to it. And that's what happens when you don't know Law Arabiya. Look at that. That's exactly what he said. He said, there's no meaning to it. It's just to bring attention. Are you serious? The eloquence in al-Arab, they were saying nonsense? Absolutely not. Mustahil, impossible. So وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا فَالْمُورِيَاتِ قَدْحًا فَالْمُغِيرَاتِ صُبْحًا فَأَثَرْنَ بِهِ نَقْعًا فَوَسَطْنَ بِهِ جَمْعًا. What is that supposed to be meaning? That's letting us know that those horses, when they are in the midst of that battle and they're with their hooves, they're basically hitting and striking the earth to the point that it might spark fire, and it's breathing. You could hear it when it's running because it is up to supporting its own master. Its own master. It will put in its breath, it will put in its feet, it will put in whatever power it has, even if it strikes fire, to serve its master. To serve its master. Just see that one right there. To serve its master, no matter what it takes. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us see and take the lessons of how these horses would serve their master with all their energy. Anyhow, I don't want to go to Surah al-Adiyat. Okay, so some scholars consider that eating horses is basically hated because they considered that it's it's an animal that the hadith had given its sanctity, or even the ayat, and therefore is not something that you would consume, but you would give honor to because of its participating in jihad, because of the morality that it contains. And we had 6 horses. And subhanAllah, I mean, Arabian horses definitely have a completely different intelligence, by the way, a completely different intelligence. And subhanAllah, you know, they know their friends. These animals know their friends and know who is basically supposed to be the one to take care of them and who harmed them, and etc. Okay, what about mules? What's a mule? So a mule is basically an animal that is a combination of a male and a female. What male and female what? Well, isn't that the same as a? No, but this is actually a male donkey or a female donkey and a horse. Well, actually a female horse and a male donkey. And because one of them is permitted to be eaten, which is the horse, and the other, he said makruh, thought it was haram. Remember, we had differences of opinions in regards to that, but the majority actually said that it was haram. Okay, let's see. He said, well, the other is basically forbidden to consume, and that's basically the donkeys. So he said, well, look, if it is haram, if it is one part of it is haram and the other is halal, is it considered the baby? Is it going to be halal or haram? Let's see right there. He said, وَالْآخَرُ مُحَرَّمٌ وَهُوَ الْحِمَارُ. Let's see, where did you get this wisdom or this combination from? And he said, المنتقى للباجي. Al-Baji, where's he from? Al-Baji is a scholar from Tunisia. My husband is from Baja, originally at least. Okay, and Al-Baji is a scholar, Maliki madhab from Baja in Tunisia, and basically this scholar, he was the one that said, well, this is the reason why, this is our scrutiny. And he said, well, because most of it, and we're talking about some of that composition, basically contains a father that is a donkey and haram to consume, then in that situation, we're going to consider that the whole thing is impermissible because we've got a DNA of an impermissible animal. Majority of the scholars, what did they say? Did they say mules are haram or halal to eat? Haram to eat. Majority of scholars consider it haram to eat. Okay. Now here's one thing. We're going to talk about al-jarad. What are jarad? Locust. We're going to talk about that later, inshallah. You could see he said we're going to talk about that when we speak about al-A'raf. Surah al-A'raf basically goes in talking about the locust. That's when it was brought up. Okay, majority of the scholars consider that you can eat rabbits. Now we're talking about rabbits. You can eat. Wait a minute. So why, when you say majority, does that mean other scholars considered it haram? Yeah, other scholars considered it haram. Like what? Like who? Well, it was a narration upon Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As that he said that it was haram. And so who was that? Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As? It's basically, you remember, Amr ibn al-As was one of the Sahaba. He's the one that conquered Egypt and basically opened up Egypt and became under Muslim rule in al-Fustat. That's the Amr ibn al-As. That's the Amr ibn al-As that basically went to try and attempt to get the Sahaba that fled to Abyssinia to bring them back. That's Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As is the guy that the Prophet ﷺ chose to be the leader, even over Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Umar ibn al-Khattab and all of those in the battle of that Salasil. When he was only 4 months Muslim. one of the most intelligent people. Well, it's his son. Ibn Abi Layla said, well, it's not haram per se, but it's hated. Let's see, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. He said, quote, it was brought to the Prophet ﷺ when I was sitting down, and he did not eat it, and he did not forbid anybody from eating rabbits or bunnies. And he said that it menstruates. Do bunnies actually menstruate? Yes, they do. They get a menstruation. Just like other animals too, like foxes, they also menstruate. It's weird, right? You would not think of that. But yes, let's see. So what about this hadith? I mean, is it authentic? All right, so that's what I did. I wanted to basically get us to that hadith and see. Here's that hadith. Abdullah ibn Amr al-As, that he was in this place right there, okay? And a man brought him a rabbit that he had hunted, and then he said, oh, Abdullah, what would you say about this? And he said, the Prophet ﷺ was brought a rabbit, and I was sitting down, and he did not eat it, and he did not forbid from eating it, and he claimed that it menstruates. Here's one thing. We need to, just because I have a hadith that was narrated by Abu Dawud, that doesn't make it authentic. Let's see. Now going back to study it. He said, إسناده ضعيف لجهالة محمد بن خالد بن الحوارث وأبي. Said, well, this hadith is basically a weak hadith because the fact that there is a figure within that chain of narration named Muhammad ibn Khalid ibn al-Huwayrith, that, and also his father, that they were actually anonymous figures. We don't even know who these people are. Let's see, other scholars, they basically said, like al-Hafiz ibn Hajar. Who's al-Hafiz ibn Hajar? Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani was living in Asqalan near Gaza right there. That's basically al-Asqalani, that was his name. And he basically considered it as a weak hadith. Okay, so if he considered it as a weak hadith, does that mean that there's no comment on it, and therefore leaving it as an herbivore to eat? Well, let's look at the other narration. The other narration, it was narrated by al-Nasa'i, but this hadith is mursala. What does a mursal mean? It's a kind of a weak hadith, but let's look at the quotation. أتي النبي بأرنب قد شواها رجل وقال يا رسول الله إني رأيت بها دما فتركها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فلم يأكلها وقال لمن عنده كلوا فإني لو اشتهيتها أكلتها. The Prophet ﷺ, they brought him basically a barbecued rabbit that a man had basically barbecued. And then he basically said, "O Prophet of Allah, I actually had seen blood on it." So the Prophet ﷺ, seems that he got disgusted, did not eat from it, but he told the people around him, in other words, the other people, he said, you can eat from it. If I had the desire to eat it, I would have eaten it. Okay, so let's see. So number 3 right there, let's look at it. So all he could say is al-Mujtaba, al-Kubra, basically for Nasa'i, wasalahu Ahmad. Let's see, is that hadith necessarily authentic or not? So that's what we're going to do. And here's that thing. You could right there, and I thought it would be a good idea. Here we go. And we're going to get that hadith and see what he has to say, or what they have to say about that hadith. Let's hope it just opens up. Okay, we're going to find another one right there. Okay, there's that hadith. فَإِنِّي كُلُوا فَإِنِّي لَوْ اشْتَهَيْتُهَا أَكَلْتُهَا. So right there, said ضَعَفَهُ الْأَلْبَانِي. Even though this is a second-hand resource, but basically lets us know that we would need to go to Al-Albani, and we discovered that Al-Albani had actually regarded it as not an authentic hadith. In other words, it's actually ضعيف, and you cannot necessarily depend on it in your fatwa. So, okay, so right now, what do we say? Now القرطبي says, قلت وليس في هذا ما يدل على تحريمه وإنما هو نحو من قوله عليه الصلاة والسلام إنه لم يكن بأرض قومي فأجدني أعفه. Wait a minute, what does that even mean? Al-Qurtubi says, well, there's no actually evidence in this quotation right there that this is haram. It is very similar to the words of the Prophet ﷺ when he had said, quote, it was not something when he was brought basically that lizard bub and they wanted to eat it, but then they introduced the Prophet ﷺ, invited the Prophet ﷺ to eat from it. And he said, it wasn't part of my culture. It wasn't part of my people to eat that. So I find myself just not having the gut to eat it or even the desire to eat it. Let's see. Now, this hadith is going to basically be the main hadith that is authentic. Now, that's what we want to get to. Wait a minute. So number 4, was that hadith authentic or not? Okay, here we go. This is that hadith in regards to فأجدني أعافه. Let's see, that was number 4. And he said, well, that's part of a hadith. And that the Prophet ﷺ, when he was told that this was dhab, right away he's like, oh, no thanks. Okay. And when the Prophet ﷺ was asked, is it haram? He said, no, but it was not something that I had seen and got accustomed to. Let's see. Now we go to right there. رواه مسلم في صحيح عن أنس بن مالك قال مررنا بمر الظهران فاستنفجنا أرنبا فسعوا عليه فلغبوا قال فسعيت حتى أدركتها فأتيت بها أبا طلحة فذبحها فبعث بوركها وفخذيها إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فأتيت بها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقبله. And what did he want to say? He wanted to say, well, there's a very important hadith in this regards. I recognize all the different evidences that you wanted to lay out, but there's actually a very important hadith, which is this quote, a narration upon Muslim meaning Muslim is Samarqandi. Okay, and let's see, he said he had mentioned upon Anas ibn Malik, said that they had passed by Marr al-Dhahran. Marr al-Dhahran is an area near Mecca, and then they caught a rabbit, and then they all ran to basically get it and fetch it, and then when basically got back and then basically managed to slaughter it, managed to do, get it cooked and all of that. Then he came to Abu Talha, and of course, he was the one that slaughtered it, but managed to basically cook it later on. And certainly they sent to the Prophet ﷺ a part of its own leg, so leg meat and hip meat from basically that rabbit. And he said the Prophet ﷺ, he accepted the gift and he didn't say any objection. And the Prophet ﷺ accepted it. فَقَبِلَهُ. Let's see right there. You could say Sahih Muslim. And in other words, it was something that the Prophet ﷺ accepted. All right. So now we would say the end of speaking about al-Jalala for today because of Salat al-Jumu'ah. So we will end right here, inshallah. Any questions before we end for now? All right, here's what we'll do. We'll sign off for today. See you all tomorrow in the fiqh of marriage. Remember that. Inshallah, subhanakallah wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha